Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the absolute core mechanics of HTTP/2 multiplexing. Think of this like sitting down with a senior engineer to walk through a really elegant, complex state machine. You see, the transition from HTTP/1.1 to HTTP/2 wasn't just some minor upgrade. It was a fundamental, strategic shift in how web applications use network transports. Instead of relying on that old textual, sequential communication that wasted so much time and resources, HTTP made for modern network efficiency.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the multiplexing solution, binary frames and streams, the stream lifecycle, managing flow control, prioritization and scheduling, and we'll wrap it all up with performance and limitations. Let's jump right in.
Part 1. The Multiplexing Solution. Let's diagnose the flaws of those legacy protocols and officially introduce our hero. So what actually is multiplexing? Well, it's the strategic shift that allows us to interleave multiple, completely independent messages on a single bit stream. And the best part, we don't have to wait for one message to finish before starting the absolute next one. Instead of waiting for an entire message to go through, all these disparate streams just travel together on the wire. Both the client and the server can transmit data simultaneously, entirely skipping the overhead of additional TCP handshakes. It's incredibly efficient. When you compare HTTP/1.1 to HTTP/2, it really helps to think of 1.1 as a one-lane road. If there's a slow vehicle in front, it blocks all the traffic behind it. But 2.0, that's a multi-lane highway utilizing a single highly efficient connection. The primary technical failure of HTTP/1.1 was application layer head-of-line blocking. Because requests had to be processed in strict order, a stall in just one response blocked the whole pipeline. HTTP/2 literally eliminates this completely.
Section 2, binary frames and streams. Let's see how multiplexing actually builds upon this core concept.
How does this work in practice? Well, it relies on a very strict process. The binary framing layer takes your messages and divides them up into discrete frames, interleaves them on the wire, and then magically reassembles them on the other end, regardless of what order they arrived in. Every single piece of data is encapsulated within a frame, and each of those frames starts with a fixed 9-octet header. So, the sender might shoot over a headers frame for stream 1, and then instantly follow it up with a data frame for stream 3.
And this right here perfectly illustrates why multiplexing is just so much faster. By letting HTML, CSS, and JavaScript frames transmit concurrently, we are completely eliminating those sequential wait times, and we severely slash perceived page load time. We avoid massive latency hits simply because we aren't opening 6 or more new connections to a single host. By sticking to one long-lived connection, the protocol stays in a warm, ready-to-go state. Now, to manage all this concurrency without causing a massive pileup, we use stream IDs. These follow some pretty strict addressing rules. For example, odd numbers are for clients, and even numbers are for servers. This entirely prevents state collisions. Because all this data is interleaved, these 31-bit unsigned integers are literally the only way endpoints can associate a specific frame with a specific request context. Also, keep in mind, Stream 0 is exclusively reserved for connection control messages. It cannot hold any application data. You might be wondering, why do these stream IDs matter so much? Because they are the sole mechanism that allows both endpoints to untangle all these interleaved frames without total chaos ensuing. The second a frame arrives, the receiver looks at the ID and instantly sorts it. Plus, these IDs cannot be reused. Once that number space is exhausted, the connection is gracefully terminated using a go-away frame that specifically identifies the last stream ID. Moving on to part 3, the stream lifecycle. Let's map out the exact progression that governs these streams. The stream lifecycle is a very rigorous progression. It cycles through idle, then open, into half-closed, and finally closed. This ensures that peers remain perfectly synchronized during really complex data flows. So a stream starts idle, it opens up when a headers frame is sent, moves to half-closed when one side signals an end stream, and then finally hits the terminal close state, where all those resources are safely released. The absolute game changer here is stream independence. If one single request stalls out because it's waiting for database I/O, it is not going to tear down the connection or block the progress of your other active streams. The protocol gives us an RST_stream frame, which lets an endpoint immediately terminate just a single stream, like maybe a client-side cancellation, without destroying the entire TCP connection. It's incredibly resilient. Section 4, managing flow control. We definitely need a way to stop fast senders from monopolizing our streams.
Think of flow control as a crucial speed limit for your data. Why do we need it? Simply put, to prevent resource exhaustion, memory overflow, and packet loss on the receiver's end. In a multiplexed environment, if you didn't have this, one super fast stream could just gobble up all the available buffer space. And unlike TCP flow control, which is end-to-end, this is a very granular hop-by-hop mechanism.
Every single stream keeps a flow control window, which basically operates as a credit system. It defaults to 65,535 octets, and this depletes as data frames get sent over. Crucially, though, only data frames consume this window. Control frames like headers or settings are completely exempt. This makes sure that important management signals never get stuck behind a massive wall of bulk data.
So, what happens when you run out of credits? To avoid a complete dead stop, the receiver asynchronously fires back a window update frame to replenish the sender's credit based on its current processing capacity. This specific type 0x08 frame carries a 31-bit integer that represents the exact increment of credit being granted. This lets the senders seamlessly resume transmission without totally overwhelming the receiver.
Part 5. Prioritization and scheduling. Let's look at the actual logic dictating what gets put on the wire first.
Stream prioritization is all about assigning higher value to critical resources. Why is this so vital? Well, delivering your CSS before a massive background image is going to drastically improve the browser's time to first render. Clients actually provide contextual knowledge to the server here. Without this prioritization, the server might just dump a giant image onto the wire before the vital CSS, which would honestly result in performance worse than HTTP/1.1.
Historically, this whole concept was modeled using dependency trees. Clients would express that certain streams shouldn't consume any bandwidth until their parent streams had finished processing. Streams were even assigned an 8-bit weight to determine how bandwidth was shared. Now, while modern implementations have evolved way past these complex tree schemes, the underlying conceptual lesson, signaling priority, remains absolutely critical for performance today.
Ultimately, the actual scheduling of frames is handled by the server's internal engine. It balances priority hints, available flow control windows, and overall resource constraints to carefully orchestrate data onto the wire. The HTTP/2 protocol defines the signals, sure, but this scheduling logic is left entirely up to the server implementation itself. That is the secret sauce where the true performance of an HTTP/2 stack is actually realized.
Finally, Section 6, Performance and Limitations. Let's visualize the real-world results of this architecture and acknowledge its boundaries. Let's walk through a real-world resource loading example. Imagine the server dynamically interleaving fragments of an HTML file and a CSS file simultaneously, and then effortlessly rebuilding them right in the browser. The client asks for index.html on stream 1. The server starts sending it, but then pushes style.css on stream 2. The server dynamically interleaves those chunks of HTML and CSS together, and the client sorts it all out flawlessly, using those unique stream IDs.
All of this translates into absolutely massive performance benefits. We're talking significantly lower latency, drastically reduced network contention, and maximized bandwidth utilization, all through a single warm connection. Factor in field section compression via HPAC and the sheer power of concurrency, and web applications easily bypass the sluggish startup phases of multiple TCP sockets, leading to dramatically faster page rendering. But is multiplexing perfect? Not quite. The remaining Achilles heel here is TCP head-of-line blocking. You see, if a single packet gets lost, it pauses all the interleaved streams. Because HTTP2 still runs over TCP, the transport layer demands strict delivery order. If one packet drops, every single multiplex stream halts completely while TCP retransmits. It's a fascinating limitation of transport layers, which really makes you wonder, exactly how does the QUIC protocol finally break free of this bottleneck? Something to keep in mind as you continue exploring the evolution of web architecture.